Psychology Spring 2017 Diversity and Public Interest webinar series. We are kicking off 2017 with some amazing topics and presenters so you can fuel your social justice tank and stay inspired for this very important year of learning, resistance, and liberation. We are starting off strong with today's presenters in a webinar titled Believing Black Lives Matter, Integrating Strategy and Spontaneity into Social Movements for Students and Early Career Professionals. We have some really wonderful presenters today who are truly living and breathing this work. So I want to introduce Dr. Candice Hargens, formerly Dr. Candace Crowel. Congratulations, Dr. Crowell, you're in a new phase of your life, and we're so excited about that. She is an assistant professor at the University of Kentucky. She studies sex, social justice, and leadership with a love ethic at the center of all of her work. As a student and now as an early career professional, she continues to engage in social justice work centered around the movement for Black lives through healing practice, scholarship, and social media. Dr. Hargens has also been a leader in psychology, serving as APAGS, APA, and Division 17 governance and leadership roles there. Currently, she serves as a Division 17 council rep to APA and treasurer of the Society for Counseling Psychology Early Career Professionals Committee. She's also an APA Minority Fellow. Welcome, Dr. Hargens. Then we have Dr. Jamika Falconer, who is an accomplished counseling psychologist, educator, entrepreneur, author, and civic leader. Dr. Falconer holds a PhD in educational and counseling psychology from the University of Missouri-Columbia and was awarded a Fulbright Award Fellowship in Global Health in 2014. As a psychologist activist for social justice, Dr. Falconer has been involved in breakthrough conversations about race and equity and has been a leader in the efforts to bring healing to the city of Ferguson, Missouri. She is a past president of the Association of Black Psychologists and president of the Tougaloo College Alumni Association, both in St. Louis. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Dr. Falconer. She is also a reviewer for the Journal of Black Psychology and the APA Convention proposals. Last but not least, Reuben Faloughi is a scholar, musician, and speaker. Born in Georgia and a fourth-year counseling psych doctoral student, his journey through higher education began at the University of Georgia, where I am now. We are very proud of you, Reuben. As a student athlete, shortly after earning a Bachelor of Science in psychology at Georgia, Faloughi began to transition from student athlete to student activist. Faloughi participated in his first protest on December 2nd, 2014, while attending the University of Missouri. He was one of thousands touched by the murder of 18-year-old Michael Brown and soon became a leader in the movement for change. Reuben, along with 10 other Missouri students, organized #ConcernedStudent1950, a group whose actions led to an unprecedented series of events on Missouri's flagship campus. Now, Reuben travels to other universities to discuss his experiences in the movement, diversity and social justice, and personal and organizational change. If we were all in person together, I would ask the audience to give you a huge round of applause and welcome. We are so excited to be learning with you today. The format for today's webinar is each presenter will share about their experiences related to the topic for about 10 to 15 minutes. We will have a dynamic and rich question and answer, so please use your chat box. I will be monitoring those. The presenters know I'll pop on and give them about a 2 to 3 minute warning. Reuben, you are first up. Ready?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that warm introduction. I can't start any of this without gratitude, and I'm just smiling because I'm so happy to be with you all here and amongst such radical scholars. So first, shout out to everybody at the University of Missouri that struggled and continues to struggle with marginalization, and even just the graduate school grind, including ESCP and the Counseling Psychology program. Shout out to Division 17, Debbie, Rashida for helping get the logistics of this set up. The radical scholars within APA that I admire and have had the chance to work with over the last year, Dr. Copley, Dr. Hargens, formerly Dr. Crowell, Dr. Stevens-Watkins, Dr. Falconer, and Della. We actually have an article coming out in the Counseling Psychologist, so Stay tuned. It's going to rock your socks. And finally, gratitude to you all, the audience, for making time. I wish I could see each one of you all, connect, see into your soul. But I'm glad you're here. So without further ado, I want to begin by saying what my beliefs are. So I believe in radical love and peace. And my intention is to use my life and my experience as almost a case study for continued personal and institutional growth for everybody. And so as I talk, I want to challenge everybody to consider an alternative perspective, just temporarily, and consider how you might think, act, or feel in various points of my story. It's going to be abbreviated, but we'll get the idea. Okay. So first, I gotta emphasize the organic nature of activism. Like I was listening to the bio, and it's like I cannot believe she's describing me. But 4 years ago, when I moved to Columbia, I'd never had intentions of being at the epicenter of a social movement or a student movement. To be honest, I was still figuring out who I was, because it was only years, a few years before that I realized that I was a walking zombie, so to speak, or unconscious. I was in this identity crisis. I noticed that there was a conflict between who I thought I was in my head and then my behavior, my actions. And so, I began to realize that I was becoming a product of this toxic environment that I was in as an athlete. I began to realize, hold on, I'm seeing women. I see women as objects, but I have 5 sisters. That doesn't add up to me. Or I have these beliefs about people who are gay, and I don't want to hurt people. I don't want to be violent towards people. So there was a lot of personal growth and guilt, feelings of guilt that I felt. And then the institution, again, sending conflicting messages to me. They didn't help me make this any easier. So actually, I'll tell you a little story that might help you understand this. But when I was playing football, we were in one meeting. It was a small meeting with one of the coaches. And then I'll never forget this, but we were just talking about what it means to be a student athlete. And he stopped everybody, and he said this. Now check out. So watch the gesture. So he was like, school first, football second. I'll do it again. School first, football second. Now what that told me was there were some, overt expectations, expectations they tell everybody, but then there were some covert expectations. And so, I mean, that just rocked my world, because I began to realize that myself nor this institution was behaving in accord with the espoused values, things that we said we're about. And so it hit me that I was involved in this multi-billion-dollar business scheme that some would call a slave plantation. And I was the laborer or slave, relatively speaking in some instances and figuratively speaking in others. I felt exploited, and I had to get out of football. And so that's how I got to graduate school. And so I think I was so happy to be off this plantation, so to speak, that I didn't realize that higher education was a very, very, very similar beast. The politics, money, greed, bureaucracy, the oppression of people of color, women, other marginalized groups, it's all there. But it tends to be a little bit more subtle. So what did this look like in my experience? I can only talk about my experience. Well, I could talk about a lot of other experiences, but I think mine is most valuable for this. So it looks like, a white professor asking you to play rap music, as if I can't listen to country music or R&B, the very narrow view of what it means to be black. Or, being introduced as an athlete well after my first year of being a graduate student. I mean, and I'm not saying this is intentional, but the undertone of that message is that I can only be an entertainer or an athlete. I'm not sure if this person can be a scholar. Fast forward, I could go on and on all about microaggressions, but those things add up. But fast forward to August 9th, 2014, it was as if a veil was just lifted over my eyes, or off my eyes. Michael Brown was killed, and I was torn up. I entered a depression. I realized that I was walking around with this false sense of security. Um, I had experienced discrimination, but I never considered that I could be the next Michael Brown. I could be the next hashtag. And so that triggered me to find some new spaces to be in, spaces that would validate who I was. And so I went to my first protest. It was a protest held by MU for Mike Brown. It was started by three strong queer black women. Shout out to them. And that would be my introduction into activism or into the world of protest. And so I will begin to organize with MU for Mike Brown that following semester, spring 2015. And eventually I would create my own organization with some other students to advocate for marginalized students. And so the goal of this organization was to be unaffiliated with the university and to support, develop, and advocate for marginalized students on the campus. And so we would do cool activities. Mainly it was just a place to be. You know, you walk around and experience so much violence at a predominantly white institution as a person of color or other marginalized person. And sometimes you just want to be around people who you know care about you. And that was that space. And so we would have very candid conversations. And this is actually where we had a conversation with the student. I mean, we would get, there's a spectrum of how people react to the campus climate, but I mean, and it ranges from, the inability to feel safe or welcome on the campus to people actually wanting to, die by suicide because of their experiences on the campus. And so, that triggered me. People who, the few people who look like me want to take their lives because people don't care or don't want to do their jobs or are indifferent. So myself and three other students, we wrote a letter to the chancellor and the three senior level provosts. And so we wanted a strategic plan with deadlines for accountability. I don't think that was too much to ask for. We wanted to see change on the campus. We didn't want students to keep hearing these students are going through what they were going through. And you wouldn't believe what they told us. Basically, metaphorically speaking, they slapped us in the face. They basically told us to join. They forwarded us to these to the other black student organizations on campus for our voices to be heard. Like, you can't talk to us directly, almost. And so they acted as if, one, we weren't between the four of us, each affiliated with all of those organizations, and two, it was as if they were listening to those organizations in the first place, taking them seriously, which they weren't. And so in this letter, as stated, as consequence, quote unquote, there'll be a series of demonstrations on campus highlighting the ignorance, violence, and blatant disregard that administration is currently showing towards minoritized students at Missouri. And then what do you know? Fall 2015 begins. Now, I would go into detail about all of that, but there's tons of resources available. But I think a good video, it's mind-blowing to me that a lot of people haven't seen it, but if you haven't seen it, go on YouTube and watch the 2015 homecoming protest. Because what it does, I think it gives you an idea of the climate in this environment. It really reminds me of, the contemporary civil rights movement, the civil rights movement in the 60s, the sit-ins. Check it out. You'll see exactly what I mean. But in a nutshell, I realized that we were in this new civil rights movement. And, with race, white people feared, hated, or simply were unconcerned about the well-being of black people in the Mizzou community. Period. It was becoming more and more obvious. And, it looks different. So basically, Mizzou didn't celebrate or value the efforts of black students historically and still today. And it's a long-standing trend. And it's not just Mizzou. You can look at across higher education and see these things, and it's not just with students. It's with faculty and staff. I mean, not to go into too much detail because we don't have all the time, but just think, should somebody have to not eat for a week to hold the institution accountable? Or should black students have to be threatened to be killed for asking for better conditions in their class? And we're in an institution of higher education. Like, does that it's bizarre and it's perplexing. But you see what happens. People when people don't feel like another party is listening to them, they protest. Protest is a form of communication. When there's a communication breakdown, people protest. That's all. So that's what happened here. But to wrap up my section, and then we can always go into this with questioning. Mizzou created this perfect storm for what happened in fall 2015. It wasn't on accident, and it just didn't happen in fall 2015. It was a long-standing, blatant disregard for marginalized groups, and in this instance, it was Black students. But I want to emphasize that Mizzou is not a unique institution when it comes to oppression. Neely Fuller and Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, they talk about how systems of oppression, specifically racism, white supremacy, but I believe it could be other forms of oppression, sexism, heterosexism, etc. They function in all areas of human activity: economics, education, entertainment, law, labor, politics, religion, sex, war. It's all there. You look, you're conscious. So the question is, how can we begin to recognize how we, each of us and other people, create and sustain these systems of oppression? Now, people start asking me these questions. Well, what do you do? What do you do? How do you do it? Come talk to us. And I'm like, all right, I got to figure out what this mess is, because oppression, the goal of oppression is to confuse us and make us feel powerless. Like, what is this? How do we make sense out of this? So I was able to synthesize this, into 2 action steps, and it involves building consciousness and building community. And maybe this changes as I go through life some more. This is only 26 years of ideas and experiences. But for me, this building consciousness is like Naeem Akbar. He talks about this internal consciousness being this internal knowledge of the self. And so questions like that I've been asking myself, it's who am I? How do I treat myself? How do I feel about myself? What do I fear? Why? Who do I think I am? Do I believe the perceptions of others? Why do I? Am I behaving in accord with my values or the values of someone else, or an idea even? Am I oppressed? Do I hold privilege? What does that mean for the people around me? And science supports this. It's not just coming out of my head. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, it's a theory for psychotherapy. It says or purports that humans can change their behavior by becoming aware of their thoughts and their feelings. All right, and so I think building this consciousness, it allows us to become aware, and analyze and challenge these misperceptions of not only ourselves but others. So for me, what does that look like? So I'm more than a job, I'm more than just a graduate student who doesn't have power. Or I can be proud of my blackness. I can be unapologetically black. Or in other instances, because this person is X, Y, and Z, insert marginalized identity, a woman, a gay, that doesn't mean that they're a threat to my existence or that they are X, Y, and Z. These scripts that we have in our head about certain people when we really don't know. Okay, so that's building consciousness. And then I think the next is finding, creating, and sustaining healthy communities. And I use this to describe any connection, whether this is intentional or unintentional, with other individuals or groups with a common goal. So this could be you and your colleague, your department, your college, your country, and so forth on. And so I think these are spaces for teamwork and collaboration, both within and between different groups. And I think we're often involved in communities in the forms of institutions without knowing it. So these can be political communities, religious communities, institutions of higher ed, law enforcement. And I believe that most times our communities are dysfunctional, and there's plenty of statistics to support that. We tend to find that these communities are sources of pride, self-esteem, comparison, but in turn we also create these in-groups and out-groups. So like, males versus females, or, students versus faculty. And so I think when we work to build these communities, it allows us to work within and between groups more effectively. But I think that forming communities, these healthy communities, it takes work and commitment. They don't just happen um, with the status quo. I think it begins with asking questions such as, how do we behave in communities? How do we treat our neighbors and I like to call it, so I teach this diversity and social justice class. It's a discussion-based class, and we sit in a circle. We call it a village, because it's this idea of like, this is my neighbor, so, what does that mean for this to be somebody I care about? How do we respond to others in distress? Do we care? Do we listen? How do we show that? And how do we know when to remove ourselves from communities that are unhealthy? All communities aren't communities we need to be in. But I think communities can be a powerful source of education and accountability to help us work through and away our guilt, fear, anger, and hopelessness. Like, I told you earlier I experienced some guilt with, having those feelings of homophobia, but it wasn't until I was able to talk to people who shared those identities and really learn and listen from them that I said, hold on, feeling guilt doesn't do anything. It doesn't change this. But taking responsibility, speaking out, wow, it changes things. Learning more about it, listening, those are things. Taking responsibility for, not being a part of that oppression is a powerful thing. Okay, so to kind of wrap it up, we got some awesome presenters after me. Consciousness and community are huge, and I don't know if one comes before the other. I think these two things are happening simultaneously, and we need to work on them simultaneously. But I think when we do begin to work on these things, consciousness and community, building these things, it allows us to reframe activism from something just an activist does to something that we all can engage in through living an active lifestyle and personal responsibility for the world. I think every decision, thought, feeling that we make can be intended to challenge our internalized oppression or the oppression of others. And I know I probably am making this seem easier than it really is. And it's a very scary, uncomfortable process, figuring out who you really are. But I think, why am I saying that? Because most people won't engage in this process. Most people will take what other people say, it's the truth. Most people will take what the media says, it's the truth. Well, what do you think? So I think, and this is very personalized, so everybody has to find out what it means for them to move from being an observer to an active participant in this greater human community. Because at the end of the day, we are all human beings, all right? And I think it's easier to look outside of ourselves, to a president, to a religious figure. But I believe the true answer to our problems comes from the self, you. And so I think this looks different for everyone. There's no one answer to how we do this, or a standardized manual written for the liberation of oppressed people, because if there was, I would have checked it out already. I think there are only various perspectives. And so I guess the question I want to leave for you all as I finish up is, what is your vision for the society? What's your vision? What do you want to have happen? Not what you don't want to have happen. What do you want the society to look like? Stop doubting it. Stop doubting it. Believe it and create it. Actually create it. You can. You're responsible for it. And with that being said, actually, hold on, before I finish, I want to emphasize this is the new civil rights movement. And this is an all hands on deck affair. And I believe it's going to take everybody if we want to see better days ahead. Like, it can get worse before it gets better. I don't think it has to, but what are you going to do to make that happen? I think we can win. I think we are winning. But I think it's important to remember that we need each other and we can't do it alone. And so blessings and positive vibes as we enter this new phase. And I think, and what I think is the revolution for liberated people.
Thank you, Reuben. Appreciate so much your intersectional journey of personal liberation and your reminders really for us to be building consciousness and building community as kind of some lessons from your own journey. Dr. Falconer, you're up next. So thank you so much. Just a reminder to folks that you can use your chat box if you'd like to ask questions or comment on what presenters are saying, and we'll be tracking that throughout the webinar. Thanks.
Good afternoon, people. Well, today I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do in my daily work and how I see myself involved as a counseling psychologist, and I try to remain active in my community. So I'll start by kind of piggybacking on what Reuben said, because I think what he said was a really big component of the Black Lives Matter and how it works within counseling psychology. And if we go back to the situation at Mizzou with the students and how the students really took initiative and got themselves involved, worked with administration, and demanded change. I think when we look at that as a model of activism, it really says everything that we as counseling psychologists need to be doing and encouraging others to do, mainly our students. So I was really excited, of course, as a Mizzou alum, to see how engaged the students were, and the fact that they have this list of demands, and they were really consistent in working with administration. And as you can see, there were some administrative changes as a result of their demands and their actions. So as psychologists, we really have to be proud of their efforts. And again, if we use this as a model for what we really want to happen for our students, and it's hard to have that as a model for our students, to see our students engaged in this type of activism, and we as working academic psychologists or just in practicing psychologists, we are not doing that ourselves. It's hard to expect them to do something that we aren't doing. So I want to just start by saying I think there are many different ways that we can be active and encourage activism. And I tell my students this, and I say this in presentations all the time, that doesn't mean that everyone has to go out and protest. I'm not saying that at all. Everyone is not, they don't have the personality to protest. They don't have the interests to protest. They don't have the time to protest. And there are many reasons. And I think as counseling psychologists, we can't be alike. We can't all do the same things because we all have different strengths. So for me, I was out protesting because by nature I am a protester. I like to be physically active in the protest. But for some of my colleagues, that just wasn't where they saw their strengths. But I think we need a little bit of everyone to be involved. So one of the ways I tell people that they can be involved in activism as a psychologist is through their courses and their teaching. Many of us as psychologists teach, whether we teach full-time or as an adjunct or online or whatever the context is, we usually engage ourselves in some teaching. And I think one way to get students involved in activism and to model activism is to teach that in our courses. Whether that means we're teaching about critical race theory or one of my favorites, Helen Neville's theory of colorblind racial attitudes. I use that in my classes a lot, and I find a way to merge it into pretty much any topic that I teach, whether it's strictly counseling psychology or not. Because for me, I want my students to be aware of how that factor is relevant to pretty much everything we see in America, in this country today. So teaching about colorblind racial attitudes, critical race theory, teaching about police brutality in the Black community is another way to really keep the focus on Black lives and how much they matter. And when we think about colorblind racial attitudes, I think it's important to note that we as psychologists need to know how much our students and how much our community and how much if we see patients, how much our patients really, how they really feel about this concept of colorblind racial attitudes. And when I talk to my students about it, I tell them that it's the whole idea that race doesn't matter, or I don't see you as in your color, I see you as a person. 20 years ago, that was acceptable, and 20 years ago, when you heard that, you were like, wow, this person isn't racist. And so now when we hear that, we know that that means other things. But I think it's important for us to explore that concept in multiple facets of the country. For instance, in the schools, I teach in an applied educational psychology program for master's students, and it's also a school psychology program at Webster University. And the whole concept, of course, of applied education is to apply the education and the psychology. So this is one way we can apply it by, let's look at a group of teachers and see how much they believe in this colorblind racial attitudes. Let's look at students. Let's look at graduate students. Let's look at graduate faculty. There are lots of different ways to do it. It's important to know how people feel about these concepts, because these same people are in the structures that define who we are and that determine really our choices and our paths in life. For instance, if we look at Missouri, in my state of Missouri, they just passed this new statute January 1st about fighting in schools. So now we know in Missouri that if a student gets in trouble fighting in school, it can be classified as a felony. That's a huge thing, right? Especially if we look at that in relationship to colorblind racial attitudes. What if the teachers who are making these reports of the students in the fighting, what if these same teachers believe that black people are animals and black people are monsters? What does that mean for these same black students in these school districts? What if superintendents feel that way? What if principals feel that way? What if their peers feel that way? And their peers and the reports of their peers have to do with these reports and these criminal charges. So it's lots of different ways to look at activism. We can do it in a teaching component by what we teach our students and what we teach our students to teach. If, for me, for instance, I teach students. So I'm very aware of that if they're teaching K through 12, ways they can infuse that into their own work. So activism can be on a lot of different levels. Outside of protest, you can protest in your class by teaching. You can protest in your class by doing research. I'll use an example of some research me and my students are working on right now. We're looking at the effects of Trump's election on hatred in schools. And we're going to specifically be looking at that in some of the St. Louis area schools, because if you've been watching the media, you know that back in November we had some issues in our St. Louis schools regarding incidents occurring where students felt comfortable saying how they felt about black students. And as a result, specifically in my district, we had high school students who walked out of the school for a number of days to protest. Again, another way to see students be active. In my son's middle school, they even organized demonstrations and protests with their administration. So as a parent, as a psychologist, I can get involved in events that occur at my children's school. That is another way to be active as a psychologist. And I think sometimes people forget that. As a parent, I go to school every day. I drop my kids off. I pick them up. Other parents know and recognize me as a psychologist. Other ways we can get the word out and get exposure to us, you know, as professionals. A lot of times people don't know what we do. They just think we see patients. So a lot of ways to gain exposure is to be active in their schools, in their events. We can help to plan and organize some things they do. I recently helped to organize a presentation at my son's middle school. It's a panel, really St. Louis based, but they travel around, called Mother to Mother. And they go in for groups of not just women, but men as well. And they talk about the experiences of being black mothers and raising black sons. And usually in that audience of usually hundreds of people, you'll see lots of white mothers who are there listening to these stories of how these women have had to endure just the day-to-day struggles of having a black son, getting calls from their sons saying they've been pulled over, they've been arrested, they're being followed by police. And it's a very impactful panel. So I was able to help coordinate that, bring that to my son's middle school. Again, that's another way. It's not a traditional way that counseling psychologists are involved in activism, but it's a way that you can still remain involved and help some younger people and gain exposure for psychology. So those are just a couple of ways. Like I said, teaching, research, community activism. But I also want to talk about one of the other things I do in my day-to-day job, which is practice. I know as psychologists we do research, we do teaching, we do practice. I have a private practice, And my focus of my private practice is geriatric care, so most of my patients are over 65. However, there are also, some that are under 65. And I think as psychologists, we can really look at our practice as activism. It depends on how you define it, but for me, my practice is very much being involved in activism because I look specifically at the patient population. Not only are they older adults, most of them are African American. I tend to see probably 80% African American patient population. Activism is also my office being in an African American part of town. Some might call that the hood, but I set up shop in a place where I know that my patients can get to me easily because oftentimes transportation is an issue. So I wanted to make sure they were able to come. So for me, my work that I do with my patients and the whole way that I organize that work is a form of activism. What I talk about with my patients, empowerment, a multicultural or feminist perspective, encouraging them to look at how race and class affect their life situations and what they can do to change it. All of that, everything I do day to day, I see as activism. And I think as psychologists, we have to really expand what that view is, and we have to expand what that view is for students. In order for them to get out into the world, like students like Reuben, to get out into this field and realize that there are various things that they can do to still be active. Because although Reuben is a protester and he likes to have his feet on the ground, he's going to run into many other students who want to be like him once he gets out, and they might not all want to take that same path, but they still want to be involved and they still want to make a difference. And I think there are various ways we can make a difference. I also want to point to the emotional emancipation circles that were founded by Dr. Grills and Dr. Rowe from the Association of Black Psychologists. They have been very impactful across the country as far as providing a space for Black people and people who support Black people to sit and talk about what this feels like, what the trauma is like, what the long-term effects of the trauma is. Emotionally, what does this feel like every day to wake up and know that this is the world we live in. Our children live in this world. It's painful. It's not always fair. But the emotional emancipation circles provide a space for us to do that. So I think that's also another way to look at activism. Again, it doesn't have to be one-on-one individual psychotherapy practice, but it can be group therapy. It can be community-based groups, support groups. It can be church-based. One time, go in and do this talk and this workshop to allow people a time to vent. I think it can be done on a lot of different levels. And I think we have to, as counseling psychologists, be open to collaborating with other types of psychologists, like school psychologists. The school violence lately has been huge, and I think it'd be great if we could all work together as far as activism. But we have to be able to show that Black lives matter, not just in counseling psychology, but in all areas of psychology. I should probably wrap up, right? But before I do, I just want to say a couple of other things about how important I think it is to work with students and teaching in schools. I mentioned the whole issues going on in Missouri with the teaching, but I think there are so many other ways that we can guide our students as counseling psychologists. I think we have a huge platform. I think our training prepares us to really do some things that other types of psychologists are not able to do. And in many ways, we feel more comfortable stepping into those situations and doing them. We feel more comfortable speaking out about injustice. We feel more comfortable meeting with community leaders and politicians. And I think because we feel more comfortable doing those things, we should definitely engage in those. Write about that. Like Reuben just said, we've written about it lately. Speaking about it, blogging about it. Dr. Kevin Coakley does op-eds. He writes about it a lot and gets the word out. I think there are many ways we can do it, and I think.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Falconer. We're getting some great questions. There's a little problem with your audio towards the end, but your reminders to really engage for specific methods in teaching research, really how to get active in those areas in community. The where people's different comfort levels may be across the spectrum of activism, a reminder that a fist in the air is awesome, but everyone's fist in the air may look like in the school system. So thank you so much. We're getting some great questions about...
I'm just looking at the question now, I'm sorry.
Yeah, about if service learning is an effective way to facilitate social movements for students and ultimately get institutional support in that way. So we'll have Dr. Hargens up next, but just keep asking your questions. We will have some time, at least about 10 minutes to go through those. So we've got some great questions on the doc, some about self-care, some about fear. How do you engage in Black Lives Matter activism as a student or early career professional when you're anticipating pushback? And really a question of if either of you have experienced some of that pushback. So we'll hold on the questions, but thank you, Dr. Hargens, and thank you, Dr. Falconer. That was wonderful. So Dr. Hargens, you're up next.
I have 4 points that I want to make for everyone so that we can emphasize how can I do this? What does it look like? What does it feel like? Questions that I get a lot. People make the assumption that I am fearless, and they make the assumption that I'm extroverted, and I want to be very clear with you, despite my putting it out there presentation persona, that I'm a very sensitive, introverted person, and I feel everything. I feel it all. So that shouldn't be a limitation to what you do. It should be an understanding of how you need to do your work. I really appreciate the point that Dr. Falconer just made about protest looking different and activism looking different for everyone. Because for me, my first attempt at a protest was met with me fainting at a Trayvon Martin rally. So my physiological constitution is not made for being in a large group of people as an introvert, rallying and crying. I can do it, but I need some specific parameters. Even at the APA Solidarity March, I had to sit down the entire time because I know that if I'm standing and I'm in a group and I feel everybody's emotion and energy, I may not make it through the whole thing, but what I can do, I do well. So I'll start with number 1. Run for your life. Not run away, but run the world. At the local, the state, the national, and organizational levels, we need you in leadership. So get a seat at the table. Shout out to Solange. I really appreciate what it looks like when diverse voices, specifically voices of marginalized people, represent in leadership. Encourage strong leaders within your community and champion their campaigns. That looks like your state level psychological association. For students, that looks like APAGs and division representatives. That looks like SCP leadership, APA leadership, and it also looks like political office. What we saw was a national and state level and oftentimes local level sweep, because sometimes we haven't been empowered to show up to those tables. People are afraid they won't be long. And you know what? You might be the first one in your state. You might be the first student in your family. You might be the first person who looks like you to be at that table. Right now, I'm on the board of the Kentucky Psychological Association. I'm the only Black person at that table at every meeting. But it's important that my voice is there, and it's important that your voice is there. So don't be discouraged by losses. Keep trying. You can run and run again. Make sure you have an awesome support team who has your back, who will campaign for you if that is not your strength, as it is not mine. And when you get there, serve. It's not about power, it's about purpose. So don't get acting brand new at the table when you get there. You want to make sure that you're there knowing who you are and knowing what you're about, forwarding social justice movement and forwarding initiatives that benefit liberation for all people. Number 2, courage ain't comfortable. It will not be. It's not intended to be. It's not an absence of fear. It is the choice to do what needs to be done no matter how you feel. You have every right to feel scared, terrified even. We are living in times that feel quite tumultuous. Do it anyway. So that means if you fear that there might be consequences, please don't let your integrity be compromised because you feel afraid. You may receive a sanction. But if we come from, I'm speaking specifically as Black people, if we come from folks who on foot walked from Georgia to Canada several times over to free people, then you getting a reprimand in your program isn't at that same level. You can feel afraid and do it anyway. And a lot of times people's fear isn't because of the consequence, even though that's the named fear. It's also because you fear not doing it perfectly. Don't let your perfectionism be a barrier to you being a social justice advocate. Knowing the perfect, exactly right, no one will be mad at you, flawlessly executed next step is not a thing. So don't let your fear of failure prevent you from doing the good work that you are here to do. When you mess up, because you will, do it with grace and humility. Take the correction, learn the lesson, and try again. As a person with privileged identities and marginalized identities, it's at that intersection where I make mistakes and missteps regularly. And you need to be in an attitudinal posture of empathy, humility, grace, courage, grit, patience, and love in all you do. So when you feel helpless, empathy is your first step. A lot of times people are like, I don't know what to do. I don't know if I'll do it right. Somebody has said that there's a need and I want to meet it, but I don't know how. You start with empathy. And because we're trained as counseling psychologists, we have a real strength there that we can harness, and it's time to harness it. If the best thing you can do in that moment is say, I feel you or I hear you, then you've made a good first step. You want to approach it all with humility, because none of us knows everything. We weren't designed to know everything. And so when you approach a new piece of strategy or a new social active movement, you want to be thoughtful about who can you ask, who can you learn from, where can you tap into resources so that you're not assuming that you know it all. And I've used this concept, I've heard this concept of grit used very often with people with marginalized identities. Like, how do you make it out the hood? Grit. How do you do this? Grit. No. People with privileged identities are the ones who need to cultivate grit. It's because you're protected in several ways from the difficulties of life by multiply privileged identities that your resilience needs to be strengthened. And grit is where you do that. Patience with the process means that change will take time. It doesn't happen overnight, and that's okay. It's worth the work. So be patient with it. And finally, love. And all you do, keep that. But it won't be comfortable. And be clear about the difference between discomfort and safety, because when we use safe spaces and allow that term to be co-opted by people with multiply privileged identities, then sometimes we get to mistaking a discomfort, some physiological stressors, some anxiety with a lack of safety, when in fact you can walk out of this door and be sure that you won't be harmed. So let's be clear about the knowing the difference and embracing it. Number 3 point, changing the system from the grassroots, if you're not already at the table, has a few steps that you can take. These are suggestions, but there are options that I've chosen in the past. Invite first. Give people the opportunity to decline before you assume they will decline. Bracket your fear of rejection, even if it's very valid, and put what you want out there invitationally. People at the core want to be loved and belong, so you invite people at all levels to belong to what you care about. If they say no, you ask for what you want. Different from inviting, this is a request that doesn't necessarily come with belonging. But when you ask first, if people decide to agree, there cultivates a sense of investment in what you're caring about that happens after they follow through with that request. These are psychological principles, foot in the door. So you ask for something small and you get it, people are more likely to agree to your asks that are larger. Thirdly, you recommend. So if you haven't heard anything or your requests have been ignored or dismissed, a recommendation is stronger and a more distant way of stating what needs to happen for your well-being, for your safety, for your health, for your education, for whatever you're looking for your praxis. Recommend that these things be done. And if recommendations don't work, you resist in whatever way feels right to you. If it's writing a letter, if it's campaigning on social media, if it's showing up outside of an office, if it's locking people in until you get, like our foremothers and fathers did at APA, do what you need to do, but go through those steps. And finally, the spice of spontaneity needs to be in this. So we use structure as an organization, but spontaneity is the spice. If planning and structure is the recipe, spontaneity is the soul food. My grandma doesn't measure when she cooks for us. And so sometimes you need a little extra pepper, a little extra Lowry's, a little extra Tony Chachere's to make it right. There's always a place for strategy and structure, but spontaneity shouldn't be snuffed out. That means in your syllabus, on the day post-election, I could have gone through my initial plan, but I said, let's create a space for us to process what this means for everybody in this class. Spice. That means that today we're doing this webinar instead of watching inauguration proceedings. This was planned. You put those two things together and it creates something that is delicious and it keeps those movements going. So that's all I have for you guys, because I really want to hear your questions and I'm excited about what people have to say.
Awesome. As someone from New Orleans, Tony Chachere's, wow, that just inspired me. Yes. Okay, there are so many wonderful things you said, Dr. Hargens, really this overall theme of, you know, making assumptions about ourselves or how people experience us can affect how we actually do the movement work. So thank you for those reminders and for this beautiful recipe. So we've got a first question up for Reuben. It's a brief one. What was the name of the protest in 2015 that you recommended earlier? We can't hear you, Reuben.
Sorry about that. Thanks for getting me right, you all.
You're back.
But you want to get on YouTube and type 2015 Mizzou or University of Missouri homecoming protest, and there's a couple versions. You want the version that's recorded on a cell phone. You'll notice it has almost 400,000 views or something like that. Check it out.
Thank you. And for everyone, have you gotten any pushback from colleagues for being a practitioner, scholar, and activist? And what were your own fears when engaging in activism specifically related to Black Lives Matter? And we'll ask you to we'll collectively be about a minute in this response.
I'll say, well, for me, full-time I teach online, and then I teach adjunct at Webster and do private practice. Teaching online is a whole different ball game. It's not the same pressures and expectations, I guess, is what regarding what you do on the side or what you do in your spare time. And I think at this point, I think it's probably different for early career professionals than it is for someone like me. I've been out for about 15 years now, and I think once you establish a record of what you research and teach and talk about, people expect that. But I think coming out of school and starting a career, there will be different expectations.
So, can you give me like the is it about backlash, or what were some of the consequences?
Yeah, it's basically, you know, have you experienced backlash? Some of that was in your story, just how you talked about moving beyond some of the resistance.
So yes, and I think everybody has to be real about what they're willing to risk and sacrifice for the society they want. So I think that was one of the things that we overlooked as student activists. So the impact that that resistance would have on our mental and physical well-being, spiritual well-being for some of us. I think a lot of us lost close friends and relationships with students, faculty, staff. It wasn't just all the students who were on one accord. There were students who wanted to be respectable towards the institution and do things in a very structured way that weren't going to have the same impact as challenging the system or holding them accountable in the way we wanted to. I mean, people lost jobs on campus. People failed classes. Many people were trolled on social media. Still to this day, some people can't get into graduate school. The Black Culture Center was the target of vandalism. I think they had somebody sent diapers to the Black Culture Center as if the black students were babies or crying or making all of this up. So, I mean, you see Melissa Click, even white allies, there's backlash with that too. She was fired from her position without due process. So it's a spectrum. Some things you can see and you can plan for, other things you can't. And with that being said, I still think all of it's worth it. Like, you walk on campus now, you see students walking with their head up. You see students organizing events for black students. I mean, it's just, the pros outweigh the cons, I feel like. But no, there are real consequences to this, and I think everybody has to be real about, their commitment to social justice.
Mhm. I'd say that if you're on the listserv, then yes, you already know that to be true for me. And secondarily, when I created the Black Lives Matter meditation for healing racial trauma, I posted it on my public social media page, and I received a number of people who I don't know even how they found it, who hadn't listened to the meditation, which is very much about love and healing, putting their negative comments and thoughts and ideas out there on my personal page. And so after about 2-3 days of engaging them and trying to be educational, I thought, am I being paid for this? Am I being compensated to educate people who do not care? And the answer was no. And so I just made a public disclaimer that unless you have something healing or loving to say on this page, I'll delete you. And that has been helpful from then on. But yes, always there will be some type of backlash. I tend not to be a person who notices backlash as much. I'm very focused on what I do, and I don't take very much of it personally. But when I do, I know who to go to for care and healing, and I know how to care and heal with myself.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Hargens. Okay, we're going to do a 30-second roundup. I'm going to give you some questions. You'll have about 30 seconds. It's going to be fun. All right, so Dr. Falconer, do you think that service learning is an effective way to facilitate social movements for students and ultimately get institutional support in that way?
I think it can be. I've used service learning in my classes over the years, and I will say it's an effective way to facilitate social movements or just really to progress the thinking in that area. I can't say that I'm as familiar with it affecting institutional support, but I can say for the students over the past years that have engaged in it, whether I've set them up in a domestic abuse shelter or set them up in a welfare to work program, or whatever the case is, it usually gets them very interested and very involved and wanting to do more for that cause.
Awesome, thank you. Reuben, how can we educate our white, Asian, non-Black friends and family on these issues and help get them involved? I've had friends say they don't feel like they're allowed to have a voice because they aren't Black and don't want to offend the movement and are even embarrassed. Any tips there, Reuben?
Yeah. Community. What does that look like? I've heard it called, instead of calling people out, because there's a lot of emotion involved with being a marginalized person, and sometimes we do get defensive. Sometimes we do demand before we ask, and so I think creating these brave spaces where people can take chances and come in with their lack of knowledge or lack of understanding, and be willing to educate people. And then I think people have to also be willing to be accountable for the education. So when people ask me, well, what do we do? What do we do? I'm like, well, what do you think? What do you know? How much do you know about the history of Black folks? How much do you know about the history of, if this is a white person I'm talking to, how much do you know about the history of being white? Like, if I know more about your history than you do your own, that's an issue. There's a ton of resources out there. Like, that's why, not to invalidate anybody's feelings on this day, but I have a lot of hope for now, because right now, I think the conditions of people are getting worse, which isn't a good thing, but I also think the consciousness of people is increasing, and Stokely Carmichael says this is conditions for revolution. So what does that mean? I think it's seek all resources you can, people and media, the internet. There's just so many conduits. Yeah, that.
That's great. And Dr. Hargens, last question, like literally 20 seconds. You began your discussion with an acknowledgement that you're impacted in your own social justice work. So what kind of self-care do you do that help you?
I listened to my meditation before I got on this because I created it because I needed it, because I was burning out. I get hugs. I like to snuggle. That's good for me. I like to dance. I'm a trained dancer from the age of 3. So when I'm feeling great, I might turn on some trap music, or I might turn on some classical and just dance around the house, knuck if you buck, if you will. And I like to write. So I've been writing for my life since I could write. I journal. I do things like that. I pray. I meditate. So because I'm introverted, oftentimes my self-care is private, but when it's not, it's usually snuggling up with somebody that I love.
And you got someone. So congratulations again. I cannot thank each of you enough. I mean, this is the way I want to spend my day today on January 20th, 2017. Kudos to all of the folks out there. We had over 50 people join this webinar. Thank you so much. Please be in touch. Just a reminder that this webinar series will be going throughout the spring. Our next one will be on anti-Semitism. We've got some great ones going on in terms of trans and student social justice leadership. I think Dr. Hargens, Reuben, Faloughi, Dr. Falconer, thank you so much for your work in the world. And yeah, I think I have no words. I feel the grace, the grit, the love, the community, the consciousness raising. So many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Love y'all. Bye.
All right.
Yay.
Are we still recording?